Yeah.
being there. Let's say I'm American over there, and forcing me to be circumcised to be a Jew. Well, man, I don't want to be a Jew. I just want to be a Christian.
Yeah. Well, that's the argument. That's the argument with Paul, is whether he's going to make them. They're trying to force circumcision on Gentiles to be Christians, and that's the whole argument Paul's going to raise. Yeah. No. No, but it's still going to be practiced by the Jews, because he's trying to let them know it's not for salvation purposes. And that's the argument with Titus and Timothy. He allowed Timothy to be circumcised because he was from a Jewish heritage. And so he allows Timothy to be circumcised because he's going to have to teach Jews, and he was Jewish. So he let him be circumcised. On the other side, Titus was a Gentile, and he refused to let them circumcise Titus because it's not for salvation, and that's what their purpose was. If that's helpful. I got too far out there, didn't I, on a tangent there? But yeah, good thought. So yeah, trying to get in the mindset of what he's talking about there. Good point. Other thought, comment? Ed?
At this time, the people that were proselytized, they've been circumcised, the ones that didn't were God there. Did the Jews, what did those people gain? Did Jews think that they gained forgiveness just like them? Or even though they're a Gentile, they identify with them, but did they assume they got the same benefits as the Jews?
They would assume that if they became a Jew, because now they are under the law and they were under God's protection, which we see that all throughout Israel. And it was part of that promise. Remember, he gave them a property, a promise, protection. Those people had that as God, as long as they stayed faithful to him. As long as they stayed faithful to him. So they were brought into that covenant relationship if they became a Jew and followed what they were to practice. Alex?
Went through the specific becoming, a proselyte, and it culminated in circumcision, you would be allowed into the group. Otherwise, you were halfway, like Cornelius.
Exactly.
Now, see, it was about achieving a Jewish status. But here's the problem: you can't just be a Jew because someone says that. It's about faith, and Paul's making that argument. So when you have people, bringing up issues about circumcision, it's not just a simple sniff. It's more about, well, you have to do this before we will fully recognize it. You can see that in Galatians chapter 2, where he talks about when people gained circumcision, they were separate. Why? Because the mentality
Exactly.
they had about these people are idolaters and they will not be reckoned, full members. And that show of separating is that you're not fully with us.
Yeah.
The theological message.
It was a dividing point, wasn't it?
Yeah. But that's the thing. The way that circumcision was viewed in the first century that we're kind of learning more about now. You can get it from like E.P. Sanders, Paul and Palestinian Judaism, and other people were actually recognizing it wasn't about just following the law of Moses. There was something else there.
Yeah.
It was a conversion process. But here's the thing: you had all kinds of different groups that had their own processes, and they didn't accept each other's circumcision or their process. And if you're going to become a Jew, you can't become a Jew. I can't physically make myself a Jew. There's even like prayers that or people who became a proselyte and were supposed to be fully vested, they weren't even allowed to say our father Abraham. In the prayers they would say your father Abraham. So even then there was some.
There's still some exclusion. Yeah, exactly.
And that's the major issue that you don't necessarily get on the surface of the text.
Yeah.
But we've learned more now, even in the Reformation period. Martin Luther, well, it's all about keeping the law. Well, that's what they thought, but we've learned more. And what was going on in the first century is something E.P. Sanders calls a covenantal nominalism. It was about achieving the status of being in the covenant, but the barriers to keep people out was insane. They made it almost impossible for people to come in the covenant.
Yeah, it's a good point. And Paul writes in Ephesians about Christ is going to break down this barrier, and that's what he's going to be dealing with in his writings there too. Yeah.
That is nowhere in the Bible.
Yeah.
But it was a man-made thing that God wrote down.
Yeah.
Even Paul argues that even what was the mindset of the first century, like when it came to circumcision and their rituals and traditions, were a barrier that he wrote down through Christ Jesus through his life.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's move forward on this. That's a great point. because, and that's the essence of what we have to understand to help us better have an idea of the text. So appreciate the insight. So now at age 100, Isaac is born. We know about God test Abraham's faith in offering Isaac. And then at that point, God says to him in Genesis 22:18, after he obeys God in that regard, he doesn't have to offer Isaac. We know the story. God had prepared a sacrifice, but it was a testing of Abraham's faith. In your seed, all the nations of the earth shall be blessed because you obeyed my voice. So we see the background. This is what they're going to understand. So when we look at that, we talked about the two most important facts to the Jews were what? Circumcision and the law. And so Acts 15:1, when Paul comes to Ephesus at the discussions they have in Jerusalem, he comes to the church leaders there because some men had came down from Judea, began teaching the brethren, unless you are circumcised according to the customs of Moses, you cannot be saved, is what Paul dealt with in Acts 15. He and Barnabas were in Antioch, and the Gentiles were receiving the word, and some men from Judea hear about it. Some Jews from Judea come up to Antioch and start telling them they got to be circumcised, what we've been talking about. So this is an argument that Paul's dealt with for a long time. So they go to Jerusalem in Acts 15 is where they sit down with the church leaders and they discuss this. And Peter, another conversation, a great chapter there we studied in Acts. Well, Peter, they back them up and say, no, they don't have to be circumcised. So this has been a long battle that Paul is having to overcome because of the mindset that we've been talking about and identifying. So the third discovery, we come down to it finally, what we've looked at, circumcision cannot bring righteousness. What Paul, here we pick up our next passage. Now, we're going to pick up Romans 4:9. Remember Romans 4:7-8, we ended with David. The quote from David, Psalm 32, verses Romans 4:7-8 says, blessed are those whose lawless deeds have been forgiven, whose sins have been covered. Blessed is the man whose sin the Lord will not take into account. We talked about David, his pleading for all the sins he'd committed. In Psalm 51 and Psalm 32, he actually thanks for all the forgiveness he'd been given. So God had forgiven him, even regardless of all the shortcomings of his life, is an interesting point. So he's blessed, but it's not because of his works. So now he comes to the next, with that context, he comes here and says, is this blessing, the blessing we referred to in 7 and 8, that David quoted of Psalm 32, is this blessing then on the circumcised or on the uncircumcised also? Where we say faith was credited to Abraham as righteousness. So here we're coming back to this aspect of who were these blessings on? Is it just on the circumcised or the uncircumcised? How then was it credited? While he was circumcised or uncircumcised? Not while circumcised, but while uncircumcised. So it comes back to that faith of Abraham. His righteousness is credited to him before circumcision. So Paul is making that argument, and that he's building, you can see how he's building that argument of the fact that the circumcision and the uncircumcision, as we're going to see, are going to be accepted by faith. So third discovery, circumcision cannot bring righteousness, verses 9 and 10. Then the fourth discovery, okay, so if circumcision's not for that fact, what is circumcision for? So Paul's going to answer that point in verse 11. It's a sign. It's a sign. And he received the sign of circumcision, a seal of the righteousness of the faith which he had while uncircumcised, so that he might be the father of all who believe without being circumcised, that righteousness may be credited to them. So it's given to the Jews to save them, but it's a sign to identify. It was not given to the Jews to save them, but it was a sign to identify them, a seal to authenticate them. So it was a covenant God made with the Jewish people, with Abraham and his descendants, that would be a part of that. So that was the purpose of it, to identify them, a sign of the covenant that God had made with Father Abraham. Okay, so Paul's defining that's what this is. So Paul goes into some of that too. Genesis 17:11, though, first he says, it shall be the sign of the covenant between me and you. Here's that covenant, Greg, that's going to be more described in Genesis 17, if you read through that more. Some covenant between me and you, and he'll go on to, and it included all his descendants as well, and the children at age 8. So now the fifth discovery is probably the big one, is Abraham is the father of all who believe, which includes who? It includes the Gentiles, exactly. It includes the Gentiles. To all who believed, to the Jew and the Gentile. Verse 12, and the father of circumcision to those who not only are of the circumcision, but who also follow in the steps of the faith of our father Abraham, which he had while uncircumcised. So here he summarizes the father of circumcision, Abraham, he's the father of the circumcision, and to those who not only are of the circumcision, but who also follow in the steps of the faith of our father Abraham, which he had while uncircumcised. So he's saying he was justified by faith before circumcision. So all those, whether circumcised or uncircumcised, can be justified to God by what? By faith. By faith. And it's a gift of God that we respond to in our faith. And Paul will discuss more what that includes, that idea of faith and what all it includes later. So he's again, these are more powerful words than we probably realize. I think Alex has done a good job of characterizing the environment that they were in, but you can imagine that this is going to raise some eyebrows, to say the least, isn't it? Raise some eyebrows. And remember, this is written in a letter, and Paul's hoping to come to Rome later, and which he'll come as a prisoner several years later. But this is sent to the church as a letter. This is going to be read to the churches, to the Christians that are meeting in house churches there in Rome. And it's going to raise a lot of discussion, no doubt, and issues. So now let's go back to Galatians, again, that Paul writes 10 years before this. Listen to what he says here. Therefore, the law has become our tutor to lead us to Christ, so that we may be justified by faith. It leads us to Christ because it's through Christ that we're justified by faith. That was the purpose of the law. It leads you to Christ. But now that faith has come, we're no longer under a tutor. For you are all sons of God through faith in Christ Jesus. For all of you who are baptized into Christ have clothed yourself with Christ. It's interesting, he mentions that relationship as sons of Christ, as sons of God, and he mentions that being in Christ, you're baptized or clothed with him. It says, for all of you who are baptized into Christ have clothed yourself with Christ. There is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free man, there is neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. And if you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's descendants, heirs according to promise. What promise is he referring to? What promise did we see in the chronology of Abraham is he referring to? The one back in Genesis which said what? Through your seed, what? All nations would be blessed, didn't he? We see it's fulfilled in Christ. He is the seed. He is the seed. And now, because of that, all peoples have the same relationship with the Father through what? Through faith. It's not the law, keeping the law, any kind of law. We can't earn salvation. We can't put God in our debt. It's not circumcision, which Paul continues to battle, and we'll see more discussions on that in this letter, but it's through faith. Faith that responds through obedience, as we'll see that exemplified in the life of Abraham and others. So, Greg, you have a comment? In the heart, circumcision of the heart was used by Jeremiah, and we're going to see Paul uses that terminology too. There's a change that's supposed to take place, an inward change, not this outward change as all circumcision was a physical change. There has to be a change in the heart. Alex? Yeah.
Even in Deuteronomy, God tells them, circumcise therefore the foreskin of your heart.
Yes.
That's the problem. We can't do that.
Yep.
Only God can do that. And what happens? Israel stumbles and stumbles and stumbles. But he says there's going to come a time where God is going to make a great covenant. He's going to write his law on our heart, but he's also going to take out a heart of stone and give us a heart of flesh. Ezekiel 36, Jeremiah 31. And that's exactly what the writer of Hebrews says in Hebrews chapter 8 and 10. You can do all the religious practices you want. You can circumcise yourself. You can do all the pious things, but it means nothing unless you have true, genuine saving faith in the living God and Jesus Christ.
And that's right, expressed through obedience. Barbara, you have a comment? Exactly, yeah. Yeah, we're getting that impact, aren't we? Don't you know, there was some resistance big time, wasn't there? It's, and they've grown up with all this all the time. How hard it is to change from something you've known from childhood and been taught to you from your parents and all that. You've been raised that way, and that's what you've been taught all this time. And now you're getting this earth-shattering example, but it's what was been in the law all along. It was what was in the prophets all along. Remember, Paul starts about saying it was in the law and the prophets. That's what he uses to present this argument. It was all there all along. You just missed it. Your teachers missed it. They misrepresented the teaching. And so you were raised with this bad concept of now you're struggling to grasp it. So you're right. There was a lot of resistance here. So it was always God's intent that's more than a physical sign. There's something that has to happen in your heart. You have to change. And that's what God's intent is. And that's our relationship with a Father. Not we have to respond to him out of faith, and he wants a change in our hearts. And Paul, again, he's going to talk about that more as we get into more of this letter. So he's going to discuss more practical things towards the end of the letter of Romans. He's going to get into more practical things of where we're expected to live in our faith to God, things to how we live, what we live by. Greg?
The law is something that you have, like our law today, we're supposed to fight with it. We may not agree with it, but we have to fight with it or we get in trouble. And so the way Christ paid this path is now the law it's not a heart now. Because if you truly love and want to do the right thing, then the law, you're basically going to obey the law.
Well, Paul in Corinthians is going to say you've got a law written on your heart, not on tablets of stone. So, yeah. So it's a great point you raised. So thanks for hanging with me in this study. Like we talked about, some deep stuff that Paul deals with, and we're seeing some practical side to us. But as we get into the mindset of those readers of the letter, it helps us to see how, man, what a no doubt a transitional time this was to get this message across to those. One last comment, Alex. Barbara? Thanks. Yes. Oh, yeah. They said some terrible things about the Gentiles. Yeah, they were considered dogs, and they couldn't have any dealings with them whatsoever. I mean, yeah, some of the things they write about, the things they would call them is they weren't as good as dogs, and yeah, there was a segment of the Jews that were very antagonistic towards the Gentiles. So yeah, you're trying to bring these groups together. Only Christ can do it. It's only through Christ that you can break down this barrier, and Paul's going to write about that. And so you can see the challenge that he's got here. And challenges for us today. That's how we break down our barriers through this, still through Christ. So thanks for all the good discussion. Thanks for hanging in on this study. I think there's a lot of powerful stuff in here. And hopefully we're getting the essence of the challenges that Paul has and really challenges for us if we understand the powerfulness of this message and what God's done to bring us all together. So next week, if you're reading along Truth for Today, we'll look at pages 276 to 279. We'll be looking through the next 4 or 5 verses. We're spending more time here because this build Abraham, we got to grasp our hands around this because it's going to help us better understand the rest of the writing if we get this right. So we'll spend a little more time here in chapter 4 the next couple of weeks. So again, thanks for all your good comments this morning and your kind attention.